I stood by the window in the hospital room. If I had had a good pair of binoculars or a small telescope, I could have seen the house where our little family had been so happy for so many years. I gazed out the window, lamenting how badly things had ended. My thoughts were focused on my one and only husband, Tim Sairman. We had chosen that house together and immediately loved it. The view from the terrace was magnificent, and it truly felt like a home meant for us. I remember Tim looking into my eyes and saying, "Holly, this is where we'll create our family." I wholeheartedly agreed. Tim was the man of my dreams, handsome, hardworking, with a strong moral compass. He was reliable, honest, and loyal, with a wonderful soul. Tim worked on the railroad and was also a lay preacher at our church. I never noticed any flaws in him for a very, very long time. He willingly shared in the family and household responsibilities as we raised our 3 children, 2 daughters, Dolly and Anna, and a son, Jeremy. Of course, the children eventually grew up and left us with the proverbial empty nest. Dolly was the first to leave when she married a wonderful young man named Chris. Then it was Anna's turn, marrying Saad. Although Saad wasn't particularly religious, I liked him immediately. I worried that Tim might not approve, but to my surprise, he didn't judge Saad at all. When Saad proposed traditionally and asked for Anna's hand in marriage, Tim quickly gave his consent and blessing. In fact, Tim officiated their wedding ceremony, uniting Saad and Anna before God. Finally, we lost Jeremy to a wonderful girl named Felice. When Jeremy moved out of his room, we officially became empty nesters. Coincidence or not, I started to change as the days went by. I began yearning for more excitement in my life. Tim was a good husband, a great provider, and an amazing father, but to put it bluntly, he was a bit predictable. He never did anything that made my world tremble. I know most people would consider my complaint insignificant. I'm sure many women would dream of the life I had. When we were raising our children, I didn't care that we never went to exotic or exclusive places or did anything particularly thrilling. Our life together was quite ordinary, but we shared many good moments. However, deep down, I now longed for something extraordinary. I wanted exclusivity. I wanted excitement. Our intimate life was good, but very predictable. I now desired new adventures, fresh ideas, and a little more spontaneity. Perhaps it was a midlife crisis or the empty nest syndrome. I knew my life was moving closer to its end, and I started realizing that this wasn't a rehearsal. This was the real thing. If this was all we had, I didn't want to reach the end without having lived exciting experiences. I wanted more variety in my life, more action, and more fulfilling moments. Please understand, I wasn't hurt or taken advantage of. I never doubted Tim's love for me. He was a wonderful man, as loyal as an old dog. But deep down, I started longing for a playful new puppy, so to speak. My biggest frustration was that Tim was the head of our Christian household. Our church, and I believe most churches, taught that the man is the head of the family in every way. As such, he had the final say in everything. To be fair, Tim discussed most matters with me, but we were not equals in our marriage. I felt as though he was the master of everything, including me. I couldn't tell him I wanted new experiences because he would simply remind me of the teachings that God has ordained only one way for spouses to share intimacy and only one position to do so. Strangely, this was called the missionary position. This method, he said, was for conceiving children and their birth 9 months later. He believed that enjoying intimacy in any other way was an abomination in the eyes of God. Don't misunderstand me. Making love had been pleasurable and loving for many years. It was predictable but satisfying. However, when he started experiencing issues with intimacy due to erectile dysfunction, it was no longer as fulfilling. Because of his reluctance to discuss personal or inappropriate matters with anyone, not even a doctor, he didn't seek medical help for the issue. All of this led to a perfect storm that soon gave way to thunder and lightning in our lives. With my children grown and my painful monthly cycles having stopped, I found myself yearning to make the most of my life. This yearning became a reality when I decided I needed a motorcycle. "What do you want, Holly?" Tim exclaimed. "Do you know how dangerous those vehicles are? In a collision with a car, the motorcycle always loses. You're a mother. If you won't give up this idea for your own safety, think of your children. Come on, Tim. Our children are adults and living their own lives now. It's not as if they need me the way they used to. I want to do something for myself, for once. I want to live on the edge, at least once in a while. I need to try acting without a safety net. Where are you going to keep the motorcycle? There's no room for it in the garage. I've already thought about that, Tim. The Browns have agreed to let me store it in their barn. It's just a stone's throw from our house. So, you're going to take money from our joint account to buy yourself a motorcycle? Don't I have a say in this, Holly? I'm glad you mentioned that, Tim. I've opened my own bank account, and I think you should do the same. From now on, I'll put half my income into my personal account and the other half into our joint account. You should do this too. That way, we'll each have some money to spend on ourselves without needing the other's approval. It seems like you're pulling away from our marriage little by little, Holly. Is that what this is all about? That depends, Tim. It depends on whether you'll let me do some things on my own or not. For example, I won't give up my Harley. You already bought it? Is that what I'm hearing, Holly? You heard me right, Tim. I have my motorcycle. Want to see it? I'll miss you, Holly. I think we should make an appointment with Elder Simpson to discuss our family issues. We've been together too long to throw everything away like this. Tim, I'm not going to talk to Elder Simpson. I don't need him quoting scripture about how the man is supposed to be the head of the household. That may have been true when that mythical book was written, but today, marriage should be a joint effort. Both partners should have an equal say in everything. What's happened to you, Holly? How can you call the Bible a mythical book? You, of all people, should know that equality in everything isn't realistic. Someone has to have the final say. Everyone should contribute, but ultimately, someone must be responsible for creating a solution when there's no agreement. Why does that person always have to be a man, Tim? You know what the Bible says, Holly. Yes, Tim, I know those words. I just don't think they apply to the modern world. After that conversation, Tim moved all his clothes into the guest bedroom. What was left of our marriage was now in serious jeopardy. I joined a motorcycle club and began attending meetings and training sessions. I took riding lessons, safety classes, and even some motorcycle repair workshops. That's where I met Stefan Barber. He was at least 10 years younger than me, and I was attracted to him. It was clear he was interested in me too. Not to sound vain, but I look much younger than I am. When I go out with my daughters, people often think we're sisters. I don't look old enough to be their mother. Stefan was shocked when I told him my age, but it didn't stop him from giving me plenty of attention. We went to many motorcycle events and picnics together, as well as group rides with friends. At that time, we were just friends, chatting only during motorcycle events. Both of us were married. My children were grown, but Stefan still had 3 teenage kids, 2 daughters and a son. Of course, we were mutually attracted to each other and enjoyed each other's company, but that's where it ended for a while. Stefan worked as a car salesman. When I decided to trade in my old minivan for something more exciting, I talked to him about it. He told me he had just the car for me. I went to the dealership, and he showed me a shiny red Mustang. I needed it. We struck a deal, and Stefan gave me a great offer. After the sale was completed, Stefan suggested we celebrate. We had to be cautious. It was difficult, but the relationship progressed slowly but steadily. Both of us felt our marriages were sinking. I was especially terrified of being responsible for destroying his family. I didn't want to hurt his young children. He assured me that his marriage was already over and that no matter what happened between us, he would divorce. Meanwhile, my marriage was fracturing more and more. When I brought the Mustang home, things escalated. What are you trying to do, Holly? Can't you act like an adult? First a Harley, and now a Mustang. Do you think these things will make you feel young again? Who are you even trying to be? For God's sake, grow up and act your age. At that point, Tim informed me that we were going to see Elder Simpson the following week. It wasn't optional. Remember, wives must submit to their husbands in all things, he added. Listen, Tim, I don't believe in that nonsense anymore. You can talk to the exalted elder all you want, but I'm not going. Our children are gone. They were the only connection holding us together this past year. If you try to force me to meet with Elder Simpson, I'll end this marriage right now. I'm serious, Tim. Our marriage is in your hands. The next day, when I came home from work, Elder Simpson was sitting in our living room with Tim. I simply turned around and walked out the door. I went to my sister's house and spent the night on her couch. The following day, I decided to move out. After Tim left for work, my sister and I used her truck to make a few trips to our house. Soon, I became a semi-permanent resident in her guest room, with many of my belongings moved to storage. Most reminders of me were removed from the house I had loved for so many years. Without warning, I had taken the first step out of our marriage. More steps followed quickly. I contacted a law firm specializing in marriage and divorce issues. I was assigned a lawyer named Alvin Lane, who had a degree in psychology in addition to his legal qualifications. I explained my situation and told him I wanted to file for divorce. He searched my heart and mind for ways to save my marriage, but ultimately, he gave up and instructed his legal team to prepare the necessary documents. Tim called me almost every day. We talked, but neither of us budged from our positions. After he received the divorce papers, we agreed to meet at a nearby restaurant. He was still looking for ways to save our marriage. I told him I didn't see a future for us because I didn't view our marriage as a partnership. He covered his face with his hands and accused me of extreme mental cruelty. Seriously? I thought. Does that mean I called you a terrible husband or said you were a bad father? Maybe that I told you you're a bad person, or that I regretted marrying you. Or did I insult you in some way? Have I ever done any of that? I responded, can you give me an example of my so-called mental cruelty? What about when I reminded you that wives must submit to their husbands in all things? Isn't that a mentally cruel statement?
Tim asked.
Tim, those aren't your words. If you believe in the Bible, you know those are God's words, I replied. Holly, are you divorcing me or divorcing God? By the way, Tim added, I've also been accused of being an overly controlling spouse. Please tell me what I did to deserve such an accusation. Well, for starters, you never let me drive when we went anywhere as a family, I said. Never? I let you drive more often than you think, he replied. When we went on those trips, you had already prepared lunch, snacks, and even packed the bags. You'd done everything that made the trip possible. Are you saying I should have let you drive too? Tim, I always thought you'd done your part, and I thought it was my responsibility to drive. I never suspected that you wanted to drive or that you were upset because I didn't let you. Did you ever ask me to let you drive? I'm sure I would have if I had known you wanted or even needed to. Honestly, I don't remember you ever asking to drive. Can you give me more examples of where I've gone wrong? Please, Holly, I need to understand. Oh, Tim, these accusations are just legal jargon. They're meant to provide a reason for separation, like infidelity, abandonment, or irreconcilable differences. It's just a legal justification. I understand that, Holly, but the reasons you gave aren't true. They're very unfair and hurtful to me. If you really want to get rid of me, I don't want to stand in your way. I won't deprive you of your freedom, he said. With that, he picked up a pen, signed the divorce petition, and handed the papers back to me. Then he left the restaurant. The next time I saw him was the day we went to court. The judge ordered alimony and half of all our assets, including our house. While I thought the settlement was excessive, I knew Stephen, and I would need the money. Stephen's divorce resulted in him having to pay alimony and child support, in addition to letting his wife keep the house, at least until their children turned 18. Stephen also had to pay half the rent for that house, but wasn't allowed to live there. Just think, he said, if she remarries, much of this obligation will disappear. That's why I guarantee she'll never marry again. She might be someone's wife in every way, but it'll never be official. She's smarter than that, and so am I. As I walked out of the courthouse, Elder Simpson intercepted me. I had seen him in the courtroom, but certainly didn't want to talk to him. He simply placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "When you offend one of God's servants, it never goes unpunished. You might avoid it for a while, but it will come. It always does." What an old fool. If he was trying to scare me, he failed. I felt sorry for Tim, but not for what Elder Simpson said. Stephen and I didn't move in together after our divorces. I bought a small house with the money Tim gave me when he bought out my share of our home. It felt like Stephen and I were still dating. We were more than friends with benefits, but less than husband and wife. Getting married would have been a mistake for us. It would have stopped my alimony payments, which funded much of our exciting life. Stephen and I had incredible experiences together. We attended major sporting events, including a World Series game, the Super Bowl, and the NCAA Final Four. We moved in exclusive circles, living the very definition of an exciting life. We had fantastic vacations, even traveling to England and France. We took photos together at Big Ben and the Eiffel Tower. We also visited some of the best national parks, sometimes on our motorcycles. There was excitement both inside and outside the bedroom. Tim would have considered many of the things we did sinful. Stephen, however, took me to heights where the air was so thin I often felt like I might lose consciousness. He introduced me to many things, the most surprising of which was the experience of multiple pleasures. Unlike Tim, Stephen recognized no boundaries. While Tim was always gentle, Stephen was assertive. His actions sometimes bordered on roughness. He dominated me, and I loved it. In some ways, I fulfilled my biblical role with Stephen more than I ever did with Tim. I completely submitted to my man, just as the good book instructed. However, I'm sure Elder Simpson wouldn't have seen it that way. He would have condemned me outright. At first, all my children turned their backs on me. That was the only real price I paid for what I did. Over time, my 2 daughters accepted the reality of my new life. Only Anna forgave me. Dolly didn't forgive me, but allowed me back into her life. My son, however, may never accept what I did, let alone forgive me. He remains completely on his father's side and refuses to speak to me unless it's absolutely necessary. The first dark cloud of my new life appeared when a hailstorm swept through the city, damaging the roofs of nearly every house, including mine. I needed a new roof, but since I had insurance, it wasn't too bad. However, when the roofing crews started the repairs, they discovered that part of the roof's supporting structure was rotten. Upon further investigation, they found that an entire wall was decayed and covered in toxic mold. The cost to renovate the house was $20,000. I had bought the house for $80,000. If I had gone through with the renovation, I would have invested $100,000 in a house that was only worth $80,000. I consulted a lawyer about suing the previous owners for not disclosing the rot and mold, but he said we'd have to prove they knew about it before the sale. This could prove difficult. After further investigation, it was discovered that the sellers had gone through an expensive divorce and likely didn't have the means to pay such a large sum of money. The lawyer said that even if we could get a judgment against them, which was highly uncertain, collecting the money would be an entirely different matter. It was a discouraging situation, as he put it. A few days after receiving the bad news about my house, while browsing the internet on my iPhone, a pop-up window appeared. It read, "The former believer has rejected God. The punishment will be 3 curses. The first curse has already begun. 2 more will follow unless immediate repentance occurs." I laughed. A curse? I concluded that the message might have been sent by one of 3 people, Tim, Jeremy, or Elder Simpson. Regardless of who was responsible, it was a despicable act and definitely not a Christian one. How they managed to get it to appear on my iPhone screen was a mystery in itself. After 2 days, I started believing in curses. Somehow, the entire town found out about the condition of my house. An inspector came, and my house was declared uninhabitable. This meant I had to vacate immediately. I was then given 30 days to either start repairs, demolish the house, and clear the lot, or sell it to someone else with full disclosure about the rot and mold. What were the chances of that leading to a sale? I also learned that insurance companies love collecting premiums, but are reluctant to pay out claims. They would cover the roof replacement, but the rot and mold were not included in my policy. The damages were extensive. I knew that paying $20,000 to renovate the house wasn't an option. Demolishing and clearing the site would have cost me $88,000. Considering that I could have sold the land for $122,000, my loss would still have been $76,000. I discussed this with Stephen. Reluctantly, he invited me to move in with him. This brought some complications, especially when it was his turn to have the kids. It also allowed me to see sides of him I hadn't noticed before. We were lovers and spent a lot of time together, but we each had our own personal sanctuaries, our private lives, and the best of both worlds. When I moved in with him, however, things changed. We were always together, except when one or both of us were at work. This was an entirely different situation. The things that hadn't bothered me before suddenly became much more irritating when I saw them all the time. It was a collection of small things, his facial expressions when he disagreed with something, how quickly he got angry when things went wrong, and how opinionated he was about people, especially my friends. And, of course, there was the universal problem of the toilet seat being left up. None of these were major issues, just small actions and looks that became annoying. What disappointed me most was how he treated his children. He was very intolerant and quick to punish. It wasn't my place to interfere, so I said nothing, but his parenting skills were far from what I had seen in Tim. After a month, one morning on my way to work, I saw Tim's truck parked outside a small cafe he liked to visit for breakfast. I decided it was time to confront him about everything. When I entered the cafe, he was sitting at the counter. I sat down next to him and said, "Let's move to a booth." He looked at me with a surprised expression, motioned to the waitress, picked up his coffee, and walked to an open booth. I sat across from him and ordered coffee and a Danish. When the waitress left, I looked him in the eye and said, "All right, Tim, what's this nonsense all about?" His expression convinced me that he had no idea what I was talking about. I had lived with him long enough to read him. "What are you talking about, Holly? Even for you, this is strange. What nonsense are you referring to? You need to shed some light on this," he said. "Before we get to that, take a look at this," I said, showing him the city's condemnation report. He was stunned. "I heard from the kids that you had problems with your house, but I never heard it was declared uninhabitable. Can't you get your money back from the sellers?" he asked. I tried. I consulted a lawyer who said I might get a judgment against them, but it was unlikely since we'd have to prove they knew about the issues when they sold the house. "Even if I managed that, I've been there," Tim said. "I've gone through something similar." I ignored his comment and showed him the message about the curse, saying, "If you're not behind this message, then it has to be Jeremy or Elder Simpson." "Holly, how would it help me to hurt you? I need things to go well for you and your boyfriend, so he'll marry you, and I can start saving part of my paycheck. I swear, I don't know anything about this message. And as for Elder Simpson, he died 2 months ago. How did you not see this in the news? His car was hit by a train. It was all over the news." "It must have been when Stephen and I were abroad. I wasn't following the news from my hometown," I replied. "The kids told me about your trip. It must have been nice." "Too bad I can't afford such a trip," Tim responded. I ignored his comment. "It seems I need to talk to Jeremy. He must be behind this," I muttered. "Jeremy? He might be upset with you and the family situation, but he'd never do something like that. The boy still loves you. He just can't handle the consequences of what he's seen," Tim said, pausing. "So, where do you think this message came from? Do you expect me to believe it was sent by an angel?" "No, Tim. I don't think so. But I also don't think you should dwell on my lover or his family. They've suffered the most because of my actions. I might have been knocked down, but they've been dealt a much harsher blow." Tim sighed. If his wife accepted the loss of her husband and family without any thoughts of revenge, then she's a saint, he said. "Tim, she doesn't seem like the kind of person who'd seek vengeance," I replied. "Well, that would make her a saint," he repeated. "Listen, Holly, I know the fire chief well. We play cards once a week. I think I can arrange something for you. You could offer your house to them for a training exercise. They could burn it down and clear the area at no cost to you. Then you could put the property up for sale. I'm not saying you'll recover all your money, but you could minimize your losses. Plus, you'd get a tax benefit since it would be considered a donation to a charitable organization. If you'd like, I can ask him to call you." I quickly did the math in my head. Losing $68,000 would be better than losing $76,000. Plus, with the tax deduction, I might end up losing less than 68,000 pesos. I thanked him and asked him to arrange it with the fire department. As I left the restaurant, I thought about Tim. He had every reason to hate me, but I was sure he had nothing to do with the false mold report. His idea of donating the house to the fire department might be my best option. I doubted anyone would buy a house declared uninhabitable, and I could end up stuck paying for its demolition and cleanup. Donating it to the fire department would save me from that. 2 days later, I got a call from the fire chief. He wanted to inspect my house to see if it was suitable for a training exercise. He asked about the mold, and I told him the whole story. We met at the house, and he inspected the damaged area. Then he said he wanted a structural engineer to review the damage to ensure it would be safe for his team to conduct the training exercise. The engineer arrived about an hour later and completed his inspection. He said he would deliver his report to the fire chief the next day. Tim called me with good news soon after. The structural engineer's report revealed that the mold in the house was not toxic. He tested it in 2 different labs, both of which confirmed it wasn't harmful. The original report had been incorrect. The dry rot could be repaired, and the non-toxic mold could be easily removed. A local company could make the house safe and habitable for about $5,000, and the work could be completed in a week. Needless to say, I was thrilled. I was so glad I had decided to stop and talk to Tim that day, and I was grateful for his concern about my problem. Stephen had been no help at all. Thanks to Tim, I discovered that the mold wasn't toxic and that the rotted wood could be replaced at a low cost. I wondered who was behind the false information that led to my house being declared uninhabitable. Could I hold someone accountable? 2 weeks later, I moved back into my little house. I was so happy to be in charge of my life again. The truth is, I hadn't really enjoyed living with Stephen. I think he felt relieved to see me leave, too. Moving out also meant I could spend much less time with Stephen. Our dates had already dwindled to a minimum. When I threatened to sue the company that had issued the false mold report, they settled and paid for the repairs. In the end, it cost me nothing. I had a new roof and a healthy home. At that moment, I paused and reflected. It hadn't escaped my notice that when problems arose, Stephen did almost nothing to help. It was Tim who came to my rescue. After everything I had done to him, he still stood by me. He could have relished my karmic retribution and left me stranded, but he wasn't that kind of person. When our marriage began to struggle, if Stephen had met some of my desires, perhaps even indulged me with some shared adventures, like buying motorcycles for both of us, I might have been happy. I believe satisfaction is a key word for us. In many ways, I had been happy with my life until I wasn't. I had been content with my husband, my family, my home, and even my church. My intimate life with Tim wasn't as exciting as what I had with Stephen, but it had brought me happiness. In fact, the sense of satisfaction I felt as I cuddled after a night with Tim was powerful in its own way, just as the excitement I felt with Stephen was powerful in another. That said, I knew I could never feel satisfied with Tim again. Not after experiencing Stephen in bed. There's something about escalation. It's hard to go back. Escalation feeds itself. Once I experienced the new positions and the almost painful sensations Stephen provided, I found myself looking forward, not backward. How long would it be before I needed something new to satisfy me? Escalation demands more, not less. I began wondering if I could change this. Could I go against the current and begin to slow down? My thoughts were interrupted by another pop-up message. This time it simply said, "The second curse is coming. Prepare yourself." Nothing bad happened until the following Thursday, when I received a frantic call from Anna. Maxwell, my grandson, had been in an accident on his ATV. He was in the hospital with severe head and back injuries. The doctors warned that there was a possibility he could be paralyzed. Stephen was away on a business trip at an auto show. Without hesitation, I picked up the phone and called Tim. He already knew about the accident and was preparing to leave work, pack his things, and head to Anna's. "Tim, do you want to come with me?" I asked. "I can pick you up. I already have my things ready. I can be at the house in a few minutes." "Just look for my SUV," he replied. "Tim, why don't we take my Mustang?" I suggested. "Holly, let's take my SUV. That Mustang holds too many bad memories for me, and the SUV has much more room for luggage and other things. That's fine, Tim, I said. You know where I am. I'll be ready when you get here. I also called Stephen and left a message telling him what had happened. I said I was going to Anna's to be with her family and help. However, I didn't mention that I'd be going with Tim. When Tim arrived, I loaded my things into his SUV. During this, I told him about the second message I had received about a curse that might have caused Maxwell's accident. Holly, are you saying you received another one of those messages, and it predicted what happened to Maxwell? He exclaimed. Show me, Holly. What does it say? I showed him the message and handed him my phone. He took it and gave me the SUV's keys. Do you want me to drive? I asked. Drive while I read, he replied. It hadn't occurred to me that he would let me drive his precious SUV. After reading the message, he said, it's not very specific. It could just be a strange coincidence. Maybe, I replied. But you admit it would be a strange coincidence. Yes, I see that, but I can't convince myself these are messages from God. They're just strange, Holly, very strange. When we arrived at the hospital, the news was disheartening. Maxwell couldn't move his legs. He was paralyzed from the waist down. If the paralysis persisted, surgery might be an option. A specialist from another city had been called in for a consultation. When the specialist arrived and examined Maxwell, he said there was a 50% chance Maxwell would recover in the next 1 or 2 weeks. If the paralysis persisted, the chances of a successful surgery would drop slightly below 50%. He advised waiting for the swelling and severe inflammation to subside before proceeding with the surgery. He also recommended scheduling the surgery now to secure a spot on the list, just in case it was needed. You can always cancel if the paralysis resolves, he said. The family unanimously agreed that Maxwell should be given every opportunity to recover, so we scheduled the surgery. We all agreed to share any costs not covered by insurance. The day Tim and I left to go home, there was still no improvement. It seemed likely that Maxwell would need surgery. Tim and I didn't get a chance to talk privately until we were in his SUV on the way home. We decided to split the drive and stop for lunch halfway. He asked me to choose which part of the trip I wanted to lead. I want to drive first, just in case I change my mind, I said. I promise I won't change my mind, he assured me, handing me the keys again. Tim, I feel like what happened to Maxwell is my fault, I said. As much as I'd like to believe this is something extraordinary connected to these curses, I can't help but feel they're aimed at punishing me. Holly, think about it. If this is meant to punish you, then why am I suffering too? I'm just as hurt about Maxwell as you are. So, if this is a punishment, it's directed at both of us. I was the one who almost lost my house because of that first curse, Tim. You're just collateral damage from the second one. I've spent many years around you, and I've never heard fire and brimstone sermons from you. But I've heard plenty from other preachers. I remember Elder Simpson himself quoting, "It is mine to avenge. I will repay. In due time their foot will slip. Their day of disaster is near, and their doom rushes upon them." Tim, I feel like my disaster is rushing toward me. Holly, that's a quote from the Old Testament. I believe God dealt with us differently in the Old Testament than Jesus does in the New. It's a bit like raising children. When a child is young and just learning, there are things they can't understand, no matter how much you explain. Sometimes you need to teach through discipline. But when they grow older, you can reason with them, and physical discipline is no longer necessary. Jesus taught and guided us through love. He moved away from harsh punishment. Remember the story of the woman caught in adultery? When they brought her to Jesus, he said, "Let the one without sin cast the first stone." And he forgave her. I do remember that story, Tim. Do you know what I always think about when I hear it? I always wonder why Jesus didn't ask, "Where's the man?" It takes two to dance, as the saying goes. Yet only the woman was brought forward to be executed. You're right, Holly. I hadn't thought of that. In your case, I don't believe for a moment that these so-called cursed messages are from God, or that you're responsible for what happened to Maxwell. What you did hurt me deeply, but I've forgiven you. If I can forgive you, how could God not forgive you too? You need to stop blaming yourself. I hope you can forgive me too. I couldn't believe this man. I had hurt him as much as I possibly could, and here he was talking about forgiveness. What kind of person is he? Why did I ever walk away from him? When Tim dropped me off at home, I gave him a light kiss on the cheek and thanked him for everything. My son still doesn't speak to me. My daughters tolerate me. They were kind to me when Tim and I went to see Maxwell, but they treated Tim with love. The difference was palpable, and I felt it. Everyone could see it. Tim went out of his way to include me in everything. I believe Tim truly has forgiven me. His actions show it. Ever since Tim suggested that it was probably Stephen's ex-wife, Celia, who sent the messages, I've been thinking about it. Was Celia behind this? She had the technical skills for something like that. Or was it Stephen himself? Were they both involved? I simply don't know. My mind is a jumble of confusion. What I do know for sure is that I made a terrible mistake. I wanted an exciting life, and I got it. More than enough of it. I ruined the life of a good man who had proven himself reliable over the years, all for the thrill of being with a younger man who offered everything I thought I was looking for. Stephen was very good in bed. Nights with him were never boring. Yes, we went on exciting trips and attended exclusive events together. None of it mattered, though. I financed most of it. Stephen had no intention of killing the golden goose that made it all possible, but things began to cool between us. I started to suspect he had found someone else. What did I expect? He cheated on his wife with me, and I wasn't even married to him. What would stop him from leaving our relationship? What would stop him from cheating on me? I knew the answer to that question. Absolutely nothing. Weeks went by, and I rarely saw Stephen. I hadn't seen Tim since we returned from visiting Maxwell. Speaking of an ordinary life, I admit I was excited at first. I had a collection of experiences, but they didn't mean much anymore. So, I was pleasantly surprised to see Stephen walking up my driveway just after I got home from work. I offered to cook dinner, but he said, "Don't worry about dinner. You'll have plenty to enjoy. I've got a pleasant surprise for you." He lifted me up and carried me to the bedroom. I won't lie, I was ready for what he had in mind. We were in bed, and he started warming me up with his touch. He wasn't rushing. It was all about the build-up, which felt different, like fireworks. It wasn't typical of Stephen. He had never taken this long before. Just as things were heating up, the doorbell rang. Stephen jumped up and ran to the door, completely unclothed. I heard him talking to someone in the living room. Why would he let someone into the house? That question was answered when the bedroom door opened, and Stephen entered with 2 other men. "Holly, my dear," he said, "I remember your fantasy about something new at night. Well, now your fantasy is coming true. Together, the 3 of us will give you an unforgettable experience." I froze. Stephen's disdain for what Jamie had done to him had seemingly turned into pity for me, a woman who had gone from desire and passion to despair and regret. It was as if he wanted to do for me what he couldn't do for her, as though God had sent him to rescue a woman consumed by her own misguided desires. We spent hours talking that day. Our conversation stretched into a simple but delicious lunch he prepared for us, and ended with dinner at a nice restaurant that evening. When he dropped me off at home, I felt like I had spent the day with an old friend. He said he felt the same. When we reached my door, he jumped out, opened the car door for me, and walked me to the entrance. His car was still running, and I was confused. I asked him to park in the garage and stay with me for the night. "I can't do that so soon," he said. "Last night, I was part of your recklessness, and now you want me to be your lover." "I want to be your lover, Holly, but it has to happen when you've calmed down and made sense of everything that's happened." I watched him drive away, and it felt like saying goodbye to my best friend. In essence, he told me he had saved me. Yes, he had participated in that act, but I might also have become a victim of it. Living out my fantasy left nothing in my heart or mind. No more fantasies for me. I wanted reality, whatever that meant. Then came another critical day. That was the day Anna called to tell me Maxwell was improving. That evening, he moved his ankles and toes. He could also feel touches on his legs. The doctors gave him a very good chance of a full recovery. A full recovery. Nothing could be better. I was as happy as I'd been in months. Maxwell was doing great, and I was back in my little house. God was in heaven, and all was well on earth. The only thing bothering me was that Anna said she had tried calling her father multiple times to share the good news. Both his home phone and cell phone went to voicemail. She left messages, but he hadn't responded. It was strange. I decided to swing by the old house on my way to work. His truck wasn't in the driveway, but what shocked me was the for sale sign on the lawn. I called Dolly, and she hadn't been able to reach him either. She was just as surprised as I was about the sign. She speculated that some kids might have put it there as a prank or that the real estate agency had mistakenly placed it. I saved the agency's phone number in my contacts. While doing that, I received another pop-up message. It said, "Today marks the third and final curse." Suddenly, my happy day wasn't so cheerful anymore. When I got to work, I called the real estate agency. They confirmed that Tim Searman had authorized his son, Jeremy, to put the house up for sale. The listing had gone live 2 days earlier. Armed with this information, I decided to do the only thing I could, gather my courage and call Jeremy. He might tell me to go away, but I had to try. I called his cell phone and was surprised when he answered. "What do you want?" Jeremy grumbled. "I know you hate me, and you have every right to. But for God's sake, son, please tell me why your father is selling the house and why he isn't answering his phone." "Why do you need to know this, Mom? Why do you think it concerns you? You left him for some guy, forget it." "All right, Jeremy. If the mistake I made is unforgivable and you can't understand that I never stopped loving you or your father, then maybe it's like your dad always said. If you needed to know, you'd be told. Do you remember that, son?"
Fine, Mom.
"You think you're responsible for what's happening? I guess you should know. That man you still claim to love is dying, Mom. He's dying. He's in a hospital in Houston, and I'm the only family member here with him," Jeremy said. "When you thought he was dead and gone with someone else, when you found a lover to replace your husband, did it ever cross your mind that it might be something more than just bad timing? Did the word illness ever enter your mind? In your absence, I brought him here to Houston to have his prostate removed. During the preliminary tests, they discovered the cancer had spread. It was stage 4. When I asked the doctor how far it had spread, he said the list of places it hadn't reached would be shorter than the list of places it had. Maybe that's why you can't reach him, Mom. Better go back to the man who makes you happy in bed. Dad can't do that anymore. You were right back then. It's good you found that man at the time." At that moment, Jeremy's tough exterior cracked, and he started sobbing. "Son, listen to me.
I'm on my way to Houston right now."
"How do I get to the hospital? What's his room number?" I asked. When Jeremy was able to speak again, he announced that they were coming back home. "We'll be leaving in a few hours. Dad is being moved into a hospice care facility right next to our old house. He'll stay there until he passes. Palliative care will help him in his final days. As for your question about the house being sold, Mom, he had to spend a lot of money to buy your share of the house. The alimony you received was also a heavy burden, along with giving you half of all his assets. And since he can no longer work, he's selling the house to make sure we, his children, aren't left with massive medical bills when he's gone. I hope this makes you happy, Mom. You won. You got everything. He lost. He lost big. He's as low as he can get, and it's all thanks to you. Keep enjoying your newfound happiness and leave us alone." Jeremy, listen to me and believe every word I say. I wanted to call the real estate agency and cancel the listing. I want you to bring Tim home to his home. I'll take time off work and care for him 24/7 in his house. He'll be in a home he loves and cared for by someone who truly loves him. I really love him, Jeremy. I haven't won anything. I've lost more than you can imagine. I'll dedicate myself to caring for the man who cared for me for so many years. I promise you, son, in his house, you and your sisters can come and stay whenever you want. Your old rooms will be ready. I'll take care of everything. Like you said, it's all my fault. I know it is, and it's my duty to do this for him and for our family. I'll make sure he has everything he needs. I'll even use the money you mentioned to ensure he's comfortable. Jeremy, can you do this for him? I'm begging you, son. Please help me help him. You know it's the right thing to do. When Jeremy calmed down, he said, "Thank you, Mom. I've been praying for something like this to happen. I've been praying for a miracle. I never imagined that after everything that happened, you would be the miracle. I'll make the calls to the real estate agency and the hospice care facility. I'll cancel both and bring Dad home. Thank you, Mom." I was sitting on the porch swing when Tim and Jeremy arrived at the house. I ran to the car and opened the passenger door. I helped him out and walked with him, holding his hand, to the porch steps. He struggled to climb them, but with my help, he made it. I was shocked at how weak he had become since the last time I saw him. He was out of breath by the time he finally sat in his favorite chair. Jeremy showed me the bag of medications the hospital sent home with Tim. There were 3 pages of instructions detailing how and when to take each one. The first step was to make Tim comfortable. I prepared some snacks for him and Jeremy. After Jeremy left, Tim and I stayed together in that special house for the first time in a long time. We talked like old friends who hadn't seen each other in years. There was so much to catch up on. Eventually, Tim grew tired and took a nap. While he slept, I read through all the instructions from the doctors. I was determined to give him the best care possible. When it was time for bed, I helped him lie down. He was suffering from intense back pain, so I massaged the ointment the doctors provided onto the sore area. Finally, he was able to ease his pain and fall asleep. I climbed into bed beside him, wanting to be there in case he needed anything. One night, I felt him struggling. He seemed panicked. I touched him, and when he looked at me, he grabbed my hand and calmed down immediately. He held my hand until he fell asleep again. As the days passed, we became as close as we used to be. We spent many happy hours reminiscing about the past, but never talking about the future. We were as comfortable with each other as we could be given the circumstances. We held each other every night. There were many hours when we simply held each other and cried. Perhaps we cried for different reasons, but our tears merged into a river of pain, regret, and despair. As Tim's condition continued to deteriorate, we were forced to buy a walker and, a few weeks later, a wheelchair. I knew time was running out, and I desperately wanted to take Tim to church one last time. However, we needed a specially equipped van to make that possible. I visited a dealership that sold specialized vehicles. They found a van that was exactly what we needed, a tall Mercedes Sprinter that had been modified with a wheelchair lift and other equipment. The salesperson wasn't sure if they could accept my motorcycle as payment and went to discuss it with their manager. When he returned, he said the manager was on his way to speak with us but had turned back to his office midway, likely due to an important call. As we waited, the salesperson offered me coffee and cookies. And then, to my surprise, when the manager finally joined us, it was Luke. When I saw who the customer was, I took some time to think about the situation. "I made a few calls and have an offer for you," he said. I joked, "Oh, Luke, this is so unexpected, but I accept." He smiled and said, "That'll come later, but I like your response." He explained that one of his rules was to never turn down a sale. But in my case, knowing the circumstances, he had made some calls and found a perfectly equipped van that he could lend me. He pointed out that when the inevitable happened, I'd be stuck with a van I didn't need. Additionally, I would lose both the Harley and the Mustang that I loved. He said that if I accepted his offer, it wouldn't cost me anything, no matter how long I needed the van. "Luke, you have no idea how happy I am to have met you," I said. "I know the circumstances were terrible, but at least something good came out of something bad. This will mean so much to Tim, and I'll be forever grateful." "Well, Holly," he replied, "I don't know anything about your work either. I guess we had more important things to talk about back then. Don't you think we need to catch up more when the time comes?" I hugged him and whispered my thanks in his ear, and he smiled. When I got home, I told Tim that I had rented a wheelchair-accessible van and that we would use it to go to church on Sunday. I was surprised when he told me he hadn't been to church since the day I left him. Tears rolled down my cheeks as I exclaimed, "What have I done?" "I've driven you away from your God." "No, Holly, don't blame yourself," he said. "When you started down the path that eventually led you away from me, when you bought the Harley and the Mustang, when you began challenging my authority as head of the household, and even the word of God on which it was based, I started praying. I prayed harder than ever. I prayed for guidance to keep you close to me and for the preservation of our family. The day you left, I said my final prayer. More precisely, I screamed a prayer at the top of my lungs. It was the prayer that Jesus cried out from the cross. Father, why have you forsaken me? That was the last prayer I ever uttered. I haven't been to church or prayed since. When you told me about the curses, I knew it was my rejection of God that caused everything. You blame yourself, but in reality, you suffered collateral damage because I rejected him. Oh, Tim, I don't believe that. Your God would never abandon you. He's always been a God of love. Holly, look at me, he said. This shell of a man. Does this look like someone loved by God? Do you think I feel his love? I've never felt so alone. I've lost both you and God. You may have lost me for a while, but I'm certain you haven't lost God, I said. Suddenly, he asked, Are you a feminist? I laughed. I didn't want to venture into unfamiliar waters that could backfire, but I couldn't ignore the question. I'm more of an egalitarian than a feminist, I replied. I don't know if that's a real thing, but it's what I believe. I'm in favor of equality in marriage. That night, I prayed for the first time in a long time. I confessed to God that I didn't know how grace worked to gain entry into heaven. I said that if I had accumulated any points for being a devoted wife for more than 20 years and raising 3 wonderful children, I would like those points transferred to Tim's account. I admitted that it was my fault that he lost his faith. On Sunday, we went to church. Everyone was so happy to see us. They welcomed us with open arms as if we had never left. We met the new elder, Simpson's successor, who had an appropriately young appearance. He was very different in many ways from his predecessor. It felt good to return to our church. As I stood at the altar of the church where Tim and I were married, I prayed with more intensity than ever before in my life. As we were leaving, I saw Luke talking with Elder Young. Tim was busy chatting with his friends, so I excused myself and walked over to Luke. Elder Young noticed me and said, Holly, this is my older brother, Lucer. I extended my hand as though we had never met, but Luke held my hand between his own and said, Brother, this is the woman I told you about. Elder Young smiled and replied, I understand completely. I pray to God to surround both of you with his forgiveness, love, and blessings. He's not done with you too yet. Luke gently squeezed my hand and said, I hope so. When someone else began talking to Elder Young, I turned to Luke. It seems there's a lot I don't know about you. Did you tell him how we met? Every detail, Holly, he said. It reminded me that God works in mysterious ways. Can you imagine a stranger or more mysterious way to meet the person you're meant to marry? No, I can't, I replied. Had I understood him correctly? I had just received my second proposal of the day. When the time is right, I'll make it official, Luke said. In the meantime, just make room for me in your heart. I already have, I whispered. With those words, I returned to Tim, a tear rolling down my cheek. Deep down, I knew I was moving from one good man to another. And deep down, I knew I didn't deserve either of them. I am so grateful for the last 2 months Tim and I spent together in our family home. I'm glad the kids were able to visit often. We were all together on Independence Day. The view of the fireworks from our veranda was magnificent. It felt so good to be a family again. I knew the end was near. In my thoughts, I pictured our whole family gathered around Tim's bed in our beautiful home as he peacefully passed into the arms of his God. But that wasn't how it happened. That night, Tim was in worse pain than ever before. I gave him the maximum dose of pain medication allowed, but it didn't help. Suddenly, he couldn't breathe. He had to fight for every breath, struggling so hard that he lifted off the bed with each attempt to get oxygen. It was just the 2 of us. The family wasn't aware of this sudden development. I couldn't bear to see him suffer like that. I stepped out onto the porch and called our family doctor. When I explained what was happening, he sent an ambulance, assuring me they would make Tim's final hours comfortable. I called Jeremy and told him where we were. He contacted the rest of the family. When I was allowed into Tim's hospital room, he was already receiving medication through and for. He was still struggling to breathe, but the medication seemed to calm him. For a moment, I let myself wonder if they had found a miraculous cure. I read the label on the bag. It was morphine. Not a miracle cure, but a much-needed source of relief. A few minutes later, Tim was sleeping peacefully. A few hours after that, the whole family was gathered at his side. Elder Jung was there too. We stayed with him, wondering if each breath he took would be his last. It was almost like I had imagined it, but it wasn't at home. Somehow, Tim made it through the night. It seemed as though he didn't want to leave us. One of the nurses suggested we talk to him and tell him it was okay to let go. I refused. It wasn't okay. I wanted him with me for as long as possible. As the first rays of sunlight shone through the window, I held his hand in mine and swore I would never let go. And I didn't. I held his hand until the end of his life, which came about 15 minutes later. The alarm sounded, and we all looked at the monitor. The heart rate line was flat. I stayed with Tim until they came to take his body away. As they carried him out, I swear I saw something leave his body and float through the window. I ran to the window and watched it drift away. It looped over our old house and then rose straight into the sky. I watched it ascend and whispered, "Fly, my love. Fly to a better place where you'll be cherished. Fly away." Through my tears, I saw Luke enter the room. He walked over to me, hugged me, dried my tears, and stayed by my side as I continued looking out the window. If I'd had a pair of good binoculars or a small telescope, I might have been able to see the house where our little family had been so happy. But I knew it would never be a place of happiness for us again. It wasn't the house that had brought us joy. It was the family who had lived and loved within its walls. It was the laughter that echoed in the halls, the memories we all cherished, and the joy that radiated from every window, a world that filled every corner. Most of all, it was the man who made it all possible. Now, it was just a house. I was pulled from my thoughts by the sound of my iPhone. I knew that sound. It announced a new pop-up message. It was the last thing I wanted to see. My hand trembled as I picked up my phone. I read the message. It was just 3 words. "It is over."